Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, good night, whenever you are listening to this. Welcome to the next lecture in our series on introducing you to the course, to sociology, and to globalization. As you can see on your screen, we are in our Moodle course page, and by this time you should be familiar with the layout. Here are the important documents, links, and some other information, including our main course textbook, Globalization, The Essentials by George Ritzer, and chapters 2, 9, and 10 from David Newman's textbook. Just as a quick reminder, this is also where you will find a link to our course playlist in YouTube that I've curated for the course so that you can have some supplementary information as well as material that you will be using for your writing assignments. Hopefully by now you have already watched the first videos that I've posted, which can be found above this video. If you started here, that's a little weird, but that's okay. You can pretty much do what you want in an online course, but you got to meet the deadlines. Remember that an online course is asynchronous. We're not meeting. We don't have specific times to gather together like a normal in-person course. So there's a lot of self-motivation that it'll take for you to move through course material, including these videos, assigned readings, which you'll need for the upcoming midterm exam and your writing assignment. So in your calendars on Moodle, these assignments should be indicated, and you should probably have them in your phone or paper calendars as well. And it would be a good idea to give yourself a week's advanced notice for any and all assignments that you have so that you can just remind yourself that you have something due in the future. That being said, I checked the analytics on these videos. They have 5, 6, 7 views. There are 27 people in the class. So if my math correctly, there's a few people who are not motivating themselves to keep up with course material. But that's on you. When it comes time for the tests and the writing assignments, you're the one who will bear the brunt of the effects for which you have caused the situation that you'll be in. For the people who are following along, congratulations. You have my utmost respect, and I say that sincerely. Okay, so as you can see in writing under week 1, I will pretty much expect that you've read the chapter notes that are included here. This is essentially the end of material stuff for chapters 1 and 2, and I have as well that same type of material for chapters 9 and 10. The entirety of the chapters is located up here. Newman chapters 2, 9, and 10. If you forgot, that is the book that we use for Soc 111 at this university. I found over the several semesters I've been teaching this course that it's a much more readable, comprehensible book than the one that was chosen for this course, which is more suitable for the junior, senior level, in my opinion. As I say here, all of Newman chapter 2 will be covered for the midterm exam. As I say here, all of Newman chapter 9 will be assigned for the midterm exam, but only part of chapter 10 will be assigned, and I'll be showing you that in video as we proceed through these coming weeks. So let's jump into the material. We'll pick back up in chapter 2, and I want to indicate that this opening vignette at the beginning of chapter 2 is part of the material that I'll examine you on. That's what I mean by all of the material in chapter 2. So, what do sociologists study? Well, we study individuals who interact with each other, so social interactions or social behavior. But more importantly, we study this thing called society. So society is this term that gets used a lot when people say society thinks. They really kind of are personifying this collection of a bunch of different people who have separate attitudes and opinions and interpretations and biographies, ideals, ways that they express themselves. So like society thinks is kind of a term that I've heard a lot. And for a sociologist, it's kind of meaningless unless you take a certain perspective, in which case you can kind of understand the idea that society thinks. Look at the way that society is defined here as a population of human beings who share a geographic territory, a common culture, identity, and basically a governing body. So what does that tell you? Well, a lot of people think of society as like a country. So you think of a country as like a geographic location like the Bahamas that has a certain population of people who have a culture and a government. we don't really want to use these terms interchangeably, just like we wouldn't want to use the terms society and culture interchangeably, or culture and civilization. So sociology is a science, and we want to keep our terminology precise and not so vague or general that we don't really understand what we're talking about. It's very important to understand exactly and precisely what it is that we're talking about. One aspect of society that I want to clue you into is up here on page 13 with relation to Auguste Comte, who coined the term sociology. And he studied these things called social statics and social dynamics. So social statics are the patterns of society that are kind of immutable across time and across societies. One way that we can think about this is with the term social structure. So this is the idea that there are different component parts to society structures, and those different component parts do things for society, but more importantly, like they're regular patterns that we see, such as social institutions, like family, religion, education, government, the economy, healthcare, and media and military, and there are many others. Dynamics are the processes that occur that are fluid and ongoing and unfolding over time and take place during people's social interactions. So you can think of this more in terms as the process of socialization, of becoming a member of society or engaging in social practices like leisure, sports, or politics or commerce, those social practices that are dynamic. They actually have ways that people engage in behaviors with each other, social behaviors, social interactions. Globalization is a macro level, broad level process that we're studying in this course. It's the most macro level process that you can study. So in this section on page 15, where the author of your book is talking about social influence, this is more of a micro level process in which people interact with each other, influence each other. So think about your mom and dad naming you before you could even talk. That's social influence. Think about your mom and dad introducing you to your religion if they did so. So taking you to church or synagogue or mosque or temple or something along those lines. That would be social influence, and oftentimes happens beyond our ability to do anything about it. Just like when you're introduced to your school, preschool, kindergarten, or primary elementary school, like what choice did you have in that type of social influence? How about at that level, did you pick your teachers? Probably not. They were probably assigned to you. You might have picked your friends, but think about this, that if you made friends at school, it's because those particular people were at that school too. Like if you're in kindergarten or primary school, it's not as likely that you're going to make friends with people who are going to another school. It's probably the case that you're going to make friends with people going to your school. So because your family introduced you to your educational system, the school that you went to, there is where you make your friends. And this is a sociological aspect of our life, the social forces that influence our lives. Then, you start playing with your friends and talking with them at recess and at lunch and maybe in the classroom, and you begin to influence each other. So some of your friends tell you what they like in terms of clothing or food or video games or television or movies or TikTok or YouTube, and maybe you start consuming those things as well. Or maybe it's the other way around, and that you influence your friends. It's probably a reciprocal dynamic process that occurs between you, but that's more of a micro level. In this course, we're going to be interested in more macro level structures and social forces. So we move on to page 16, and this is where we start getting into the social statics of structures that are regular patterns that we see across societies throughout history. At the most micro level are what are called statuses and roles. So statuses and roles are where we human beings come into play in terms of occupying positions in society that have associated expectations, obligations, or behaviors that we should perform because there are other people that we're in relationships with. So a status, for example, is dependent upon social institutions. So you have a family. So you're probably a son or a daughter, a brother or a sister, a cousin, a nephew or a niece, a grandchild. You have grandparents. That's family. Maybe in terms of religion, you are a Christian Jew, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, agnostic, polytheistic. In terms of education, you're a student, I'm a teacher. And here's where I want to explain roles. So a status is a position in society, whereas a role is the associated expectations for behavior, the obligations, the duties, the responsibilities that we have. So your expectations, duties, obligations, responsibilities come from me as a teacher, but I don't just make those up on my own. Oftentimes we have organizations like the University of the Bahamas that set out the formal obligations or responsibilities. I have my own. I have a syllabus, I have course objectives. I need to make sure that I am providing educational material. I need to make sure that I'm providing assessments that go along with that educational material. And there's a handbook from the University of the Bahamas that kind of lays this out. There's also a student handbook, and I have that posted on our Moodle course page where you have expectations from the university, not just me. But it's through the University of the Bahamas, which is an organization that is carrying out the social functions or purposes of the institution of education. And all of these other institutions are very, very similar, except for maybe the family. Like the family doesn't necessarily have an organization that's associated with it. A family unit is a certain type of group that's kind of different from other institutions and groups. And I'll explain that here in a second. But all of these other social institutions, education, the economy, politics and law, mass media, religion, medicine and healthcare, military, sports, science, leisure, many, many others have organizations that are associated with them. So this really nice exhibit 2.1 on page 22 lays this all out. You have broad scale social institutions, family, religion, education, government, economy. And there are many different organizations that are associated with carrying out the functions of those social institutions, except for kind of the family. There's really kind of one instance or example that I can think of where families form organizations, and it's typically for family reunions, especially if there are large numbers of kinship networks involved. We have to feed a lot of people, house a lot of people, come up with games for the kids or adults, make sure everybody can get to the same place and location around the same time, and so on and so forth. That takes a lot of coordination, but that's a hallmark of what organizations do is they carry out the large scale coordination of social behaviors designed to meet common goals. And this is all done within institutional contexts. At the broader level, at the most broad level is culture. The most pervasive element of society is culture. Culture is a feature of society. So culture would be like the personality of a society. If society includes the population of people sharing a geography and a government, then culture would be the identity. It would be the heritage, the customs, the social norms that tie people together in terms of the way that we speak, the language that we speak, the foods that we consume, the clothes that we wear, the architecture around us, how it is that we greet each other, or how it is that we mourn the dead. Those are all aspects of culture, and they pretty much exist like other parts of social structure before we're born and exist after we die. So that's why we have social statics as a part of societies, is that there are components of this thing called society that exist before individuals come into the world, and they pretty much exist in the same way after those individuals leave. Now, it takes real live human beings to interact with each other to carry out the dynamic forces of socialization to globalization. And that's where it becomes interesting for sociologists, is to analyze both the statics and dynamics. Now, let me draw a connection between the most macro level aspect of social structure and the micro level elements. And it's in this word called norms. So norms are culturally defined rules of conduct, rules of behavior. Now, should you always, in every situation, greet other people, other strangers? And how do you do so? Like, what are the cultural norms for greeting your elders when you go to church or school versus greeting your friends when you arrive at their house or arrive at a restaurant or the movie theater together. There's probably different cultural norms governing or influencing or suggesting the way that most people should behave. Are these rules going to be enforced by law enforcement? Not always, not unless you're breaking a codified norm like a law. But if we go back to the section on statuses and roles, roles are kind of very similar to cultural norms, and that these are expectations for us on how to behave. But these are specifically tied to the statuses or the positions related to each social institution and the organizations that we are engaged in terms of what it is that we want to do. Are we engaged in commerce, some type of governmental activity, some type of religious activity, an educational activity like we're doing here? And then we have other people who are probably carrying out their roles, who are setting expectations for other people, and you have these mutually reinforcing interactions between people. And that's a sociological analysis of why people do what they do. Let me give you one more just on the topic of roles. So roles are kind of interesting in what they can explain. And there are two key concepts, role strain and role conflict. These help us to explain, for example, sources of psychological stress. Like if you used an individualistic explanation of psychological stress, you might start with the biochemistry of somebody's brain in terms of, do they produce enough serotonin or are they producing too much serotonin? And that's where psychopharmacological practices of physicians and psychiatrists prescribing SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, leaving more serotonin in the synapses, might try to address some issues related to stress. But that's a psychological approach. A social psychological approach would be of the order that, like, well, what triggers you in terms of bringing on stress? Is it people yelling? Is it lack of stimulation, being bored? Is it too much work? But there, a sociologist is going to start to ask more questions about society itself, like in terms of role strain and your status as a student. My course is not the only course that you're taking. You're probably taking 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 other courses, and you have multiple expectations from those other professors. In this course, coming up, you have 2 expectations in the same week. Take your midterm exam and complete your first writing assignment. So those are going to strain you in just my course, but you're also going to have other courses that you're taking at the University of the Bahamas as a student. So role strain is when we think about one single status and the strain that all the different expectations have for that particular status. But you also have multiple statuses related to all the other social institutions at the same time. So you're not just a student, you're a family member. Maybe you go to church or volunteer at a charity. Maybe you have a part-time or full-time working status in your occupation related to the economy. You have all these different expectations from all these different social institutions, and some of them can come into conflict. So you just can't be in 2 different places at the same time. Think about like how if you become a parent or how your own parents maybe had work obligations at the same time that you or their children had an athletic competition, and the parent has to choose between working and producing money and carrying out their obligations for their colleagues and their bosses versus being a family member, a mother or a father, and being attendant to their children's extracurricular, co-curricular activities. So building that bond as a family member. You just can't be in 2 places at the same time. Maybe with the miracle of technology, you can be at the athletic or maybe at the musical event or a talent show and be on your phone at the same time. But that's culturally kind of rude. Like the cultural norms for these situations maybe allow for somebody being on their phone and stuff like that. But just think about like if you're at an event and your attention is supposed to be on your child or other people, but you're on your phone the entire time. Like, what's the cultural norm for students being on their phone in the classroom? Is it acceptable? Is it unacceptable? Well, culturally speaking, it kind of depends upon who's in the room and what their expectations are. And so I'm just trying to bridge the gap between our most macro level social structure culture, our most micro level social structures, statuses, and roles, and show you that there's no clear dividing line because it's all happening simultaneously. social statics and social dynamics happen simultaneously. Micro levels and macro levels happen simultaneously. And that's one of the complexities of social realities that's exciting for sociologists, because we have to take into account all of these different factors going on at the same time. As an example of this, I pointed out in my last video that in terms of genocide, where we have these social structural forces of people abusing or exploiting their status as a government worker or a social worker and leading people to their untimely and horrific slaughter, we have those specific events in which those specific processes are carried out, but we also have the large-scale patterns across all situations that we can identify as genocides or ethnic cleansings. So you have the micro-level situational processes alongside the macro-level patterns that occur across societies and throughout history. So we can take into account both of those simultaneously to see if there's any shared commonalities or any differences or deviations between different events. So this might help us in the future stop or ameliorate or attenuate or mitigate genocides and ethnic cleansings. In terms of social structure in those situations, one feature of genocides is the creation of in-groups and out-groups. So an in-group, like your family, you think of yourself as a unit, as what we call a primary group. So we have primary and secondary groups. Primary groups are your friends and families, people you have affective or emotional bonds with. Most of our groups are secondary groups. It's groups that we have some formal affiliation with because we want to achieve a common goal. And these typically are carried out within organizations. So in-groups and out-groups are often defined by who it is that we believe ourselves to be a part of. So for example, if you're enrolled in this course, you're a part formally of SOCI 100, Section 1, Fall 2024. Do you really think of yourself as a group member with other people whom you don't really interact with? Probably not. But one of our in-groups that you share with your classmates and myself is the in-group of being at the University of the Bahamas. Like, we are all Mingos. We're all affiliated with this organization somehow, so that if we met each other on the street and didn't know each other and maybe started talking, oh, wow, you're a student at UB, I'm a professor there. Or if you and a classmate or an alumni of UB met each other out in the world, didn't know each other, got to talking, oh, wow, you went to UB, I go to UB. And now you have something in common. Out-groups can be formed where we think of another set of people as they and them, as other people. So in the case of the Rwandan genocide, the Hutus and the Tutsis were divided against each other, in which out-groups were created. And typically there's some type of hostility. So think about when you had a high school basketball or soccer game going on, and another school from New Providence came to your school, or when you went to another school. Even though you're all Bahamians, you're all Nasuvians or New Providencians, is that correct? All of a sudden in that situation, you're out-groups. You have in-group statuses due to nationality, but out-group statuses due to your school affiliation. So these are also some of the dynamic forces at work when we think about social structure. Okay, so we've looked at some of the social static forces that we have in terms of social structures, where we have a few social institutions, many organizations. We have roles and cultural norms that seem to overlap and intersect. And those are all static social structures that involve dynamic forces. In the same section, David Newman covers the relationship between a social static in terms of social structure and a dynamic global process called globalization, the focus of this course. So this is where I'm first introducing you to this concept of globalization. And the definition that David Newman uses is actually, I think, very good. It's very simple, and it's probably the one that you should use in your writing assignments if and when you define globalization. He says that globalization is the process through which people's lives all around the world become increasingly interconnected economically, politically, which are two social institutions, environmentally, think about climate change, and culturally. So think about the fact that jeans and t-shirts and Nike and Hollywood movies and video games and pop music saturate the world in many different societies. And he says, see chapter 9 for more detail. So let's do just that. Okay, so this is chapter 9. And as you can see, it has the book cover and it has a detailed chapter outline. Chapter 9 is only 16 pages. And again, I'm going to assign the entire thing for your midterm exam. So you were responsible for all of this content. Let's start off, though, with reviewing not the opening chapter vignette, but the very first section in which Newman talks about social structure and everyday life. Here he says, as you recall from chapter 2, social structure is the framework of society that exists above the level of individuals and provides the social setting in which individuals interact with one another to form relationships. That's exactly what I was just talking about. If you can use your sociological imagination to see the intersection between social structure and our biography, our personal lives, this is what we're talking about. We think about social institutions as the situations or contexts in which we interact with other people within groups, oftentimes within organizations. So, for example, Newman talks about organizations related to education, the institution of education, the National Education Association or the Ministry of Education, the groups that exist, so among the faculty, the staff, the students, classmates, fraternities, sororities, our different individual statuses as teacher, student, classmate, executive assistant, dean, principal, custodian, and the role expectations. Now, I'll point out right now that the term role expectation is redundant. Roles are expectations. They are obligations, duties, responsibilities. But anyway, like my expectation for you is to learn, to take exams, to write. Your expectation for me, hopefully, is to teach and to teach in a fair way. Then there are broader cultural beliefs that, for example, education is good for individuals and it's good for society. Maybe if you valued leisure or entertainment more, you might think like, well, education's kind of boring. You got to do a lot of unnecessary work, and why not spend your time just engaged in what you want to do, like playing video games or listening to music or watching movies or Netflix or TikTok or YouTube or something like that. But cultural beliefs tend to follow institutionalized norms. So the norm of going to school, the norm of sitting in a classroom and taking notes, maybe asking questions or something along those lines. So this is a way that we can break down, for example, the experience of being a student, of being a teacher into its social structural components. Remember that in chapter 2, when David Newman was discussing globalization, he said, well, see chapter 9 for more detail. You get to chapter 9, it starts out with, as you recall from chapter 2, there's this thing called social structure. So where is this topic of globalization that David Newman promises to talk about? If you look at the title of his chapter, it's the structure of society, organizations, social institutions, and globalization. This is important to know. This is important to memorize. For one thing, because I'm going to examine you on the title of chapter 9, I want you to know this. I want you to know that the two most important parts of social structure to analyze globalization are organizations and social institutions. That's what David Newman discusses in this chapter, and you know that because that's right in the title. One good way to study is to take seriously the titles and the chapter headings. So for example, here's the title. What are we going to study in this chapter? Well, the structure of society, organizations, social institutions, and globalizations. So you need to think to yourself, what am I going to study in this chapter? Well, and then there it is laid out for you. All of your other textbooks, whether it's physics or biology or psychology, chemistry, nursing, architecture, they do the same thing because these are tools for teaching. They're educational tools. And so they're designed to teach you. The titles, the headings, the subheadings, the boldface terms, the glossaries are all designed to help you learn the material. It's up to you whether or not you're going to take the time or energy to actually do that. So what are you going to learn in this chapter? Social structure in everyday life, like how organizations and institutions influence the behaviors that you engage in every day, as well as the life chances that you have of succeeding or failing in life. Social dilemmas, like these social processes, these dynamic forces of like what happens when individuals account for themselves only and disregard the group, or what happens when there's too much emphasis placed on the group at the expense of individuals. Those are intersections between social structural forces and our everyday lives as individuals. Then, as we broaden our perspective out to the structure of formal organizations, we'll see that there's a particular organizational type called the bureaucracy, which is a very important structure in and of itself. And we'll get to that in future lectures. Then we see that there are intersections or relationships or overlaps between organizations and institutions. And we saw this in the model in chapter 2, where you take a broad institutional context and you think about all the different organizations that are involved within that institutional context. And there are dozens, sometimes hundreds or thousands of organizations for every social institution, except for maybe the family. Then the last thing that Newman covers in this chapter is globalization and social institutions. So when we get to the end of the chapter on the section on globalization and social institutions, on page 172, we can see that David Newman is interested primarily in 3 different social institutions. Those are the economy or economics, education. You think of like education as schooling or school. We want to be careful in the terms that we use. So we say education more broadly, because it's not just school or schooling. Like you go to school to get school because society needs concurrent or new generations to understand the way the world works, to acquire knowledge, to gain information that will help them and help society. So it's not just school or schooling, it's education. And that's why for the third one, religion, we don't say something like church, because church is a Christian way of saying the sacred place that we go to engage in congregation with our fellow in-group members who share our same beliefs in terms of sacred texts. So we don't say church or mosque or temple, we say religion because it captures all the different ways that religions are organized and engaged with. So if we go back to the institution of education, we can see that there's quite a bit of discussion. And I'll point out here that one of the things that is being discussed is on the utility of standardized tests. So why is it that people all around the world take standardized tests? Is it because of some natural or random phenomenon, like one day the world just decided that all students everywhere are going to take standardized tests? It's more likely that in some locations, standardized tests began to be used. And then maybe other societies said, hey, look at the way that these standardized tests are being used in the United States or throughout Europe. What are they doing and why? Is it a successful way of helping to assess students' performance? Can we use that in our own societies? And so over time, you see education become globalized. For example, in the ways that testing becomes a global norm. And if there's a global norm, it suggests that we have something like a global culture or a world culture. So that's something that we might study in terms of social institutions and globalization, and then a broader level of social structure culture. So let's think about this for a second. David Newman is pointing out in chapter 2 for the first time his definition and discussion of globalization. And in doing so, he says, see chapter 9. So you go to chapter 9 and you see the title says, The Structure of Society, Organizations, Social Institutions, and Globalization. We go to the section where he begins to discuss globalization, and it's in terms of social institutions. And the social institutions we see here are economics, where there's a lot of discussion, education, and religion. And as it turns out, I dedicated a significant portion of the playlist commensurately to economics, like entrepreneurship, socialism versus capitalism, the failure of socialism in Africa and elsewhere in the world. But I also have material in the playlist on education, which is discussed in Newman chapter 9, as well as material on religion and globalization. So there's a lot of material that I have in this course playlist that should help you with your writing assignments and your exam material.